Welcome to Investing by the Books, a podcast by Redeye. I'm your host, Eddie Palmgren, and next to me is my friend, Niklas Sävås. How are you doing today?
Today is the best day of the year. It's my birthday, so it's fantastic today.
Congratulations.
Nice to wake up with a few gifts and songs, so I'm happy.
But mostly looking forward to today's recording.
Of course.
Yes, good. Today we are thrilled to talk with Bethany McLean, one of the world's most prominent financial and investigative journalists, a contributing editor for Vanity Fair magazine, and currently writing a book on COVID-19's impact on the economy that we are really looking forward to read. She has published 3 books in the last decade about the financial crisis, the US mortgage giants, as well as the latest book, Saudi America and the Truth About Fracking and How It's Changing the World. Yet, Bethany McLean is still probably most renowned for the book she co-authored on the scandal of Enron from 2003, with a new edition published in 2013. And a documentary based on the book was nominated for an Academy Award in 2006. Why have we chosen this book?
So it's been 20 years since Enron collapsed. Although I think most people are familiar with the company name, many might not know or remember the lessons. And I think the story is both fascinating and scary. As much as it is about business, it's about people, thinking and behavior, like self-delusion, greed and ego. And we think it's a gem with tons of lessons for investors on maybe mostly what to avoid. In 2019, I compiled a list of 20 lessons for investingbythebooks.com, and we can put a link to that in the show notes. So, Eddie, what is The Smartest Guys in the Room about?
As highlighted by the subtitle of the book, it tells the fascinating story of the amazing rise and the scandalous fall of Enron. And Enron was a Wall Street darling at the time, and at the peak, the 7th largest company in the US, before it eventually filed for the, at the time, largest bankruptcy in US history in 2001, on December 2nd, actually. And the book is chronological and takes us through how the company, and primarily management, fooled everyone, basically regulators, rating agencies, sell-side equity analysts, and investors, and it kept going for many, many years. It also shows how auditors who were paid by the company, and they were paid a lot, they had a short-term incentive to be part of the fraud. So really, to sum up, it all the lines of defense broke down in this case. So this is a bit different maybe from the other episodes we had, but how can we put this in the framework of Redeye quality rating?
I think the Enron scandal shows the importance of having an objective checklist, and that people, business and financials are the key elements in that. In Enron, the people in charge were talking more than they delivered, and large parts of the business were unproven or not durable, and the financials were simply not adding up.
Yeah. Do you have some other thoughts about the book?
I think the collapse really highlights the importance of critical analysis. Without whistleblowers, short sellers, and outstanding work from investigative journalists, the fraud would likely have gone on even longer, to the detriment of society.
We are grateful to have one such outstanding investigative journalist on the show today. Here comes our conversation with Bethany McLean. So Bethany McLean, welcome to Investing by the Books podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. Where are you now?
I am in New York.
A new apartment, right?
Yes, a new apartment in New York. I decided to get brave in the middle of the pandemic. I had lived here for a long time when I was younger, and in the middle of the pandemic, I bought an apartment. When everybody was saying New York is dead and it's never coming back and the city is done for, I thought, well, I'll still like it anyway. So here I am.
Sounds like a good investment.
Well, I bought it as a home, not as an investment, which is generally my approach to real estate. So we'll see.
That's great. And I mean, we know from listening to other interviews that you're not interested in investing.
No, it's very odd, right? I because I like financial markets. I find this stuff obviously really interesting. It's what I've covered for 25 years. But when it comes to my own portfolio, I have no desire to execute or to even think that way. It is a lot for me to even be able to look at my little bit of investments and see how they're doing. I don't care. And I can, look through the details of an investment if I'm writing about it, but if it's something I might invest in that somebody sent me, I can't. I think it's an odd, we all have our interests and then our bias to action and what form that action takes. And for me, it takes writing about something or I can't be really interested.
I think it's fantastic, and I mean, some of the best investors are quite passive, so it isn't necessarily a negative, I would say. And I would say, I mean, otherwise from your work as a investigative journalist, I mean, you're uncovering a lot of scandals, and I think that really helps others to make great decisions. So you're helping society allocating capital in a better way, I think, which is fantastic.
I hope so. I don't think I've ever gone about my work with some grand view of helping society. I've mainly done it because I'm interested in it, and I suppose that's sort of a selfish view of the world, but I do also believe that if you're not really interested, you won't do your best work. So maybe that's a rationalization.
So turning the focus to the book, The Smartest Guys in the Room, it was 20 years ago now, wasn't it?
Hard to believe. Well, the Enron scandal was 20 years ago. The book was published 17 years ago. Not that I suppose that's kind of splitting hairs or a distinction without a difference, but sounds like a little bit less time.
Yeah, and it's one of my favorite books on business in general, and I think it's packed with wisdom about business and maybe more about business gone wrong, but also I think there are nuggets in the book that is really helpful for both investors and businessmen, I would say.
Thank you.
In your own words, can you briefly introduce us to the story of Enron?
Sure. So Enron was, for a little while, one of the most admired companies in the United States and indeed around the world. They had really shaken up the staid-old energy business, which was mainly moving natural gas via pipelines, and didn't seem all that exciting. And Enron had, under its chief operating officer for many years, a guy named Jeff Skilling, had pioneered this idea of trading natural gas, much as you might trade stocks or bonds, a little bit different, but the idea that you could split natural gas up into its components and trade the contracts. And Enron really created that business. And then they began to create a whole bunch of other businesses. And so they had this reputation of being this incredibly innovative and incredibly profitable company that was really, really changing the world. They had this motto, "Ask Why." They did all these ads on national TV and magazines, touting their innovation. And I think when they all of a sudden went from darling to bankrupt within the space of about 6 months, it was really shocking. And I've often wondered why the Enron story has stood the test of time the way it has, why people still care all these years later. And I think it was because we were coming off a lot of time where there hadn't been major collapses or scandals in American business. And at that very same time, a lot of people had begun to invest on their own and put their money in the market as retirement plans moved from being defined benefit plans that pay you a certain amount to defined contribution plans, where you effectively have to take care of your own portfolio. You suddenly had all these people who had to be interested in the market, and all these employees who were getting stock as part of their retirement plans. And so everybody cared a lot more. And the idea that a company that was this highly regarded and such a superstar could just suddenly go kaboom was this moment of cynicism that I don't think we've ever really recovered from. And I think it was the canary in the coal mine for the financial crisis and for a lot of cynicism about the way things work that has come subsequently.
And just to put it in perspective, how big was Enron at the time? And can you compare it in terms of size or influence to any company today?
What's funny is I don't remember the actual loss in market cap. It was big, but it wasn't systemic. It wasn't a company that its fall was going to take down other companies. I suppose I would compare it to a little bit to if Tesla were to go bankrupt. It's different because there's a lot of skepticism about Tesla out there, so it's not the same thing. It's a different era. Obviously, in the days of Enron, it was before financial Twitter, FinTwit, and sort of the widespread availability of skeptical information, if you so desire to look. But I suppose I would compare it. I suppose that's a comparable.
Would you say the skepticism then was more hidden than it is with Tesla today, or?
No, it was very different. The skepticism was very much under the surface because short sellers there were a number of people who were skeptical about Enron who were short the stock, but they didn't talk publicly. They didn't go on TV. They didn't post their views on Twitter. So there was almost no way to know that if you were an average person investing your portfolio, there was almost no way to know that there was this immense wave of skepticism skepticism about Enron coming from very sophisticated investors that it just wasn't public anywhere. So it was almost as if there were two realities. There was the surface reality, which was the Wall Street analysts saying, buy this stock, it's going to double in the next year. Here's our $150 price target. It's 70 today. And portfolio managers saying in the press, Enron is the best company since sliced bread. And then there were these, short sellers saying very quietly, it's a fraud and it's going to go bankrupt. But the two narratives didn't meet at all. Whereas in the case of Tesla, the two narratives meet and get duked out. I mean, not really. I don't think anybody listens to each other on financial Twitter, but whatever. They're both there at least. They're present in the same reality.
And just to understand the people, because the book is so detailed and there's a lot of great portraits of all these people. Can you just take us through the key characters and who are they?
The most key character is Jeff Skilling, who was the chief operating officer of Enron, really its creator and its CEO for the last year of its existence. And he, I still find him a fascinating character. I've talked sometimes about this fine line between a visionary and a fraud, where it often is just the outcome that determines how somebody is seen. And I think if Enron had been Tesla and had continued to be able to raise money from the market and hadn't had this crisis of confidence that suddenly stopped it from being able to get cash from investors, from the capital markets, I think Jeff Skilling could have gone down in history as a visionary. One of the businesses he had created was something called Enron Broadband, which essentially was Netflix ahead of its time. But his really, I've often thought we all have fatal flaws. I think his fatal flaw was that he needed success before it had actually come. And so he needed Enron to be a star for his own ego. And so he promised Wall Street a certain amount of earnings every quarter, and damn, Enron was going to deliver. And so come hook or crook or fraud. And Andy Fastow, the CFO, was the guy who made the numbers work, who essentially came up with all these incredibly complicated financial transactions to enable Enron to report profits that weren't actually economically real. And there's an interesting nexus of personality between the two of them, because later, after Enron had gone bankrupt, the whole case against Jeff Skilling the whole criminal case against Jeff Skilling rested on whether or not he knew what Andy Fastow was up to. And the jury chose to believe that he did. And I think we in our book thought that he hired Andy precisely because he knew Andy would be willing to push the envelope in ways that would work for Jeff. So I always find these stories of business or business gone wrong, these fascinating Shakespearean dramas of not just characters, but the interplay between characters. And then there was Ken Lay, who had been the CEO of Enron, who became the chairman when Jeff Skilling stepped in as CEO. And Ken was he was a guy who grew up with nothing and became one of the wealthiest, supposedly most successful men in America. But with that came a lot of entitlement. And I've often thought to myself, well, which character do I kind of like more and have more sympathy for? The Jeff Skilling, who in some ways orchestrated this whole thing, or the Ken Lay, who just said, I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to sit here and collect my hundreds of millions of dollars. And I actually think I despise Ken Lay a little bit more.
That's interesting. I want to take us a bit back before going deeper. And I mean, you mentioned your interest in these stories. Have you always been interested in these kind of stories? Also, was that a way in for you into the investigative journalism business, or?
No, it really wasn't. But I also think that I was not a kid with a particular focus on what I was going to do when I grew up. And my family is all scientists. And so if I thought I was going to do anything, it would have been probably be a math professor. And I actually was a math major in college as well as an English major. But I probably was more driven by math when I was younger. And if I had... And my thoughts of a career were probably such that they were probably math oriented. So I never worked for my college paper. I didn't work for my high school paper. I think part of that was my own lack of direction, but part of it was also growing up in a family where the idea of being a journalist would not have been acceptable. So I think those two things kind of came together. But it's funny looking back on it, my favorite books growing up were always the sci-fi fantasy books, from the Foundation series to the Lord of the Rings to Terry Brooks' sort of of Shannara. And I think these are all these stories of good versus evil, and in some cases, relatively complicated characters and things playing out in interesting ways. And I think that probably does shape some of my approach to storytelling.
That's really interesting. And you were an investment analyst, right? It was beginning of your career.
I was very briefly. So when I got out of college, I went to work at Goldman Sachs for 3 years. At that time, they had a training program. It was supposed to be a 2-year program where they took people right out of college, and you basically worked in the trenches for a few years and got to see how things worked. And that wasn't it. I had never wanted to be a young investment banker. I don't even think I knew what investment banking was. They were not happy years for me, but it turned out to be a very useful detour, because I do think that understanding some of how this stuff works, or at least not being afraid of it, is very useful if you're going to do this kind of journalism.
I think it really shows up in the book as well. I mean, you show that you really understand the industry, and I mean, it's interesting that you came from that background. I'm an equity analyst myself, and it's quite often you see people that are either driven to that role because of that they're good with numbers, or they like to write narratives, I would say. And I would have guessed that you came in because of the narratives, but it's interesting that you came from the other side.
But don't you sometimes think there's not much of a difference between the two? I mean, there is, but you can doing a math proof is essentially a narrative with numbers.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you need to be really logical in your way of writing.
Yeah.
And that later you came to Fortune. That was right after Goldman Sachs, right?
I did. I was on my way to business school, and I thought, what am I going to do with an MBA? I'm going to end up right back on Wall Street because I'll have to pay my business school debts. And this isn't what I want to do. I want to be a journalist. And so at that time, I got really lucky, because at that time, the glossy magazines like Fortune had what were known as reporter roles, where you were basically a fact checker. So it was a way in the door for somebody like me who didn't have any journalism background, but who could arguably convince people at Fortune that I was smart enough to check and knew enough about finance to be able to check the facts on a story. And so that was my way in the door. And I got hired in 1995, which was the start, I guess, of the last golden age of journalism, because it was the first .com boom, and all the .com companies advertised heavily. And this was before the days of Google and Facebook, so they advertised in the glossy magazines. And so Fortune had more ad pages than they knew what to do with, which meant they needed more content than they could possibly publish, which meant that even for someone like me, who was regarded as not being able to write, there was a place for me to write, because they were desperate for content. So I look back on that. A lot of life is timing, and I look back on that and think I just got extraordinarily lucky, because people were patient with me, and I was able to learn to write in a way that I'm not sure you would get that grace period in a more fraught, competitive environment.
When reading the book, I was really fascinated of how it could go on so long. I mean, it seems like, I don't know if it was, but it seems like really so long time. And I mean, it feels like the odds of a breakdown really increases with, one line, it breaks down in one line, say management, maybe the first line, and then it seems like that really impacts the next line. And that's really, you wrote a book about the financial crisis, and I think it was quite similar then. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that momentum effect that's created, really.
Yeah, I was thinking about this morning, because if you spend any time on Twitter, once again, people will say, well, about Tesla, for instance, well, look at how much the stock has gone up. Of course, it's not fraud. The stock wouldn't have gone up for all these years if there were fundamental problems in the business. And I think, oh, you naive idiots. That's not the way these things work. They go on. And by the way, I'm quite neutral on Tesla. I see the pros and cons. So I'm not saying that Tesla is a fraud. I actually don't. I don't believe that. But I'm using it as an example of something where people use the stock price increase as proof that the company must be fantastic. And, that was how people thought about Enron. They would say, the board of directors, I remember one member of the board of directors saying to me after the fact, it's just a self-reinforcing quality, because you already think that these people are smart, and then you look at how the stock market is rewarding them, and the stock market is saying they're really smart, and it all becomes this cacophony of, look at how smart these guys are, and it drowns out any skepticism you might might feel. And that goes on until it doesn't. And figuring out what that point is, it's that magical, elusive tipping point that you never know in advance what it's going to be. It was the same thing with the subprime mortgage crisis. For years, people were looking at the housing market in America and saying, this isn't sustainable. These prices can't keep going up like this. I don't care that prices have always gone up throughout history. They just, this is insane. But they just kept going up until they didn't. And even then, after they stopped going up, it took a little while for that to spill over and collapse the mortgage market. So these things, I don't know. I think it's the saying, is it Keynes? I think it's Keynes who says the market can stay insane for a lot longer than you can stay solvent, right?
Yeah. Yeah, really. I mean, I think you also view the world like this. I mean, both me and Eddie tries to take a multidisciplinary perspective to things. And I mean, I'm just thinking about the engineering discipline who have this margin of error and the concept of breakpoints and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In a way, I think investigative journalists are one way of a breakpoint, but the other could be a short seller. That's also one that's really interesting to hear your perspective on.
Maybe. I don't know that either are breakpoints necessarily, at least if you think historically, it's rare that either one has been. I did this skeptical story about Enron in February, I guess, of 2001, and I don't really think it mattered. I don't think it mattered in the sense that I don't think it caused Enron's bankruptcy. I think I picked up on underlying skepticism that was already there, and then I think things followed the exact course of events that they would have, regardless of whether I had written that story. I think in the financial crisis, I don't think it mattered that lots of people said home prices cannot go up anymore. I don't think that was the break point. If you think about Wirecard, people were warning for years, maybe even a decade, that Wirecard was a fraud. You had a short seller being public. You had the FT writing really compelling pieces about what was wrong at Wirecard, and it didn't matter until it did. I guess the only counterexample I could give would be Theranos, where the Wall Street Journal's reporting really did change the trajectory of that company. So I guess to me, the more interesting question is, when is it a break point and when isn't it? And is there when is public skepticism a break point and when does it just not matter? And can you point to any differences in those cases? Or again, is it just random? I suspect it's probably random.
And the question is also like what to look for. And in the book, you really show that Enron were like masters of creative accounting. And for example, Skilling is toasting in champagne to celebrate an accounting change. And the question comes down to, and also for the breakpoints, as you say, like what is it that impacts the market? What is it actually looking at? And what should you do as an investor? One example is to compare earnings with cash flows and so on. But do you have any other such signals or tools?
Well, going back to where we began this conversation, I'm not an investor, and I pretend to be one even less all these years later than I did back when I first started my journalism career, and I was closer to Wall Street, I suppose. I'm really not anymore, but I do think it comes back to the old adage that Warren Buffett used to use, which is that if you don't understand what you're buying, don't buy it. In other words, maybe do buy an Enron when you know that you don't understand their numbers and that you're betting on the momentum or the hype surrounding the company, but at least know that that's why you're buying it and that you don't understand that there are these problems. And I think that's just being very clear-eyed. And because you can make a lot of money for a lot of years before fraud collapses, right? And as long as you're aware of the signs and you're willing to take that bet, then I don't know, go for it. But at least be clear in your own mind that there are these questions. And I think anybody who had gone through Enron's financial statements would say, I don't understand how this is working, because you couldn't. And so if people had been honest about that, then the whole thing never would have taken off the way that it did. But no one wants to be honest about that when they think they can make money. We all always, I guess we're all the smartest guys in the room. We all want to believe we can outsmart others around us.
Yeah, it comes down to circle of competence, I guess.
Yeah.
Good advice.
I was just going to say that I think obviously debt, right? I mean, it's another Buffett thing, but you can live a lot longer if you don't have a lot of leverage. And it was very clear when you looked at Enron's financial statements that its debt was rising rapidly, and that didn't make any sense for a company that was supposed to be as profitable as it was. And any company that is totally dependent on the capital markets to sustain it, you just that company is automatically subject to a crisis of confidence.
Yeah, Enron was really like growth at any price. That was all that it mattered. And
the illusion of growth at any price, I was going to say.
Yeah, the illusion of growth, definitely. But it was like the financing, what was held, scaling back. Without that, I mean, he could just go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that concept. A big number multiplied with zero is still zero, and you don't want that zero. Yes. And that's another Buffett quote.
Right.
I mean, I think maybe now we discussed Buffett, and I mean, it would be interesting to hear about your day with Buffett.
Yeah, so that was one of the few positive stories I've gotten to do over my last 10 or 15 years. And Vanity Fair was really interested in the question of succession at Berkshire Hathaway. So Buffett said, well, come spend the day with me and talk about the business. And I think what stood out to me the most about that, there were two things. One was that he said that his goal, the most important thing to him, was that Berkshire Hathaway was around in 100 years. And he thought that because it's an insurance company, and he wanted to make sure, he thought it was his obligation to make sure that it could pay, that it could stand there as an insurance company to insure these contracts for the time it had promised. And I thought, if more people thought that way, if more business people thought, my goal is to make sure my company is around in 100 years and thriving, that we would have a very different, we wouldn't see these enormous collapses that we do. But our capital markets for a long time have switched to enabling people to extract a lot of money regardless of the long-term success of their companies. And not surprisingly, we're all incentive-driven creatures, and the more that's possible, the less people care if their company survives and thrives. And I think that's a huge problem. But the other thing he said that I found really interesting, I was really exhausted, and we got to dinner and we were having our root beer floats, and I think I'd been with him since 8:00, and I think I was 6 or 7 months pregnant at the time and had the flu, and was, by that time was just like, because, talking to Buffett for that long is exhausting. I mean, he's brilliant and wonderful, but, at a certain point you're like, can I have a glass of wine and Vogue magazine? I'm done. Anyway, so I remember thinking, I'm going to ask him about his charity work. And this is going to take up all of dinner, because rich people love to talk about all the good they're doing in the world by giving away their money. So it had been some years ago that he had decided to give all of his money to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so I said, well, tell me about the work you're doing. And he looked at me and he said, I don't care. I mean, I care in the abstract. Of course I want to do good. That's why I gave away my fortune. But I know that the mechanics of how the money is given away and what we give to, those aren't my passion. So I gave it to somebody to whom it was their passion. And that was the end of the answer. And I thought, oh no. But that stuck with me all these years later, because he wasn't politically correct about his answer. He didn't have, the 3 examples of fixing malaria in Africa and how this meant so much to him. He just said, I know I want to do the right thing with my money and make sure it goes in the right place. But this isn't my passion. And I thought, how good to be honest with yourself about what your passions are, what really interests you, so that that's where you spend your time, and so that you're not pretending you're interested in something you're not for the sake of external image. And therefore, wasting your time and your real creativity on things that aren't your passion. So,
it's really, I mean, most of his success can probably be attributed to focus. I think it's one of the key pillars.
So to avoid spending time, how are you doing your time as an investigative journalist? I guess it's a bit like being an analyst for investing as well, like you trying to put the pieces together in the puzzle, do your research, your channel checks, and like, how do you balance like researching, writing, fact checking?
So I don't think there is any way to be, I don't really think there's any way to be efficient about investigative journalism or about trying to tell a story, because you have to go down rabbit holes to figure out what matters, and you have to talk to people who will turn out to be crazy, or the stories they tell will be irrelevant, or you'll decide that what they say is interesting, but it's just not germane to the narrative you're trying to tell. But you don't know unless you talk to people, and you don't know if a document is useful unless you turn over every page. So I think I've decided that the quest for efficiency in journalism is is a false one. And you have to just do everything because you never know what it is that's going to be the magic conversation that pulls the whole thing together, the document that has the fact that suddenly lights up the page. And so I am not particularly efficient. I wish my focus were perfect all the time. It's not, but that's a different story.
Yeah, because as you say, writing is both social and asocial, and you spend a lot of time talking with people, and then you spend a lot of time sitting quiet in a room and writing by yourself. So how do you get the most out of people?
Well, it's funny. I've been thinking about that because I do some podcasting now, and it's very different. You'd think that someone who is a journalist would be a natural podcaster, but I'm not. And it's made me think about the differences between the two. So if I'm interviewing somebody privately for something I'm working on, I just want to listen. And I try to interrupt as little as possible and to hear what they have to say and try to let the conversation go where they want to take it, because I'm there to learn from them and hear what they have to say. And that's very different than directing a conversation for public consumption. So I don't think of interviewing as something that's very efficient. I think of it as something where you just have to let it spool out as it will, so that you're really making sure you hear what the other person has to say.
Yeah, and then you need to go from that to actually get the story out there when you're writing, at least like when you're publishing. And for investors or anyone who is trying to act on information, it's hard to know when to say, I know enough now, and to actually stop. And I heard you say in another interview that journalism is a game of getting to 75% knowledge. So we're curious to hear like your insights on how to decide when to stop researching and actually take the decision.
To be honest, I don't think I have any great insight into that. I think I stop because most things I do have a deadline. And so if I'm working on a story, then it has a deadline. If I'm working on a book, it has a deadline, and you have to stop because you have to start writing. So I think that's the only reason I ever stop. I admire people who work on projects where they don't have a publisher yet and they don't have deadlines and they know how to get themselves to stop, because I'm not sure I ever would. I've never worked without that constraint. I've never just worked on something where it's open-ended. So I don't really know the answer to that. I do know that for me, writing is I think the reason I both like and sometimes detest writing is that for me, it's an act of figuring out what I think. If I don't write, I don't actually know what I think. And I sometimes don't even know what the questions are until I've tried to write. And so then usually once I've tried to write, I have to circle back and talk to people again, because then I have to figure out the things that I didn't figure out the first time around because I didn't know what to ask. And
Yeah, it's different parts. I guess you take it step by step. But do you have like small deadlines, or do you just have one big deadline? Or maybe it's different. But...
Yeah, usually one big deadline. For example, I'm working on a book now with the guy I wrote All the Devils Are Here with, and our deadline is March. And that's it. And so within all the chapters and everything else, I have to figure out what my deadline needs to be in order to get the book done by then.
Yeah, that requires a lot of discipline.
Hopefully get it done by then. Please, my publisher, don't listen to this podcast. Get it done by then.
Yeah, I was going to say, what happened? You sit here with us now.
Right.
So we're talking about stories as well, how to build them. And I think Enron is probably one of the best examples in the world of how to build a great equity story. And a quote that I think really exemplifies this is Skilling saying that if we put broadband into our name, that would mean everything, as you write in the book. And do you have some advice for the key elements for building a great story in general and the narrative?
You mean for a business or for a writer?
For both.
I think as a writer, I don't really know for business people. So I'll start with that first. I want to say that if you don't have the fundamentals, then the story isn't going to matter at some point. But I do think more and more there can be a gap where the story can carry you for a long time without having the fundamentals. And being a business person with immense charisma who convinces everybody that they're a visionary is worth a lot today, because it can buy you years where you don't have to produce profits and where the capital markets will throw money at you. And that is probably gives you a huge competitive advantage over the person who doesn't know how to spin a story. I think at some point the reality does have to catch up, and you do have to produce the fundamentals, but depending on the craziness in the capital markets, that gap can be longer and longer. So I've become a little bit more cynical about that. I used to think businesses shouldn't tell stories. They should just present the facts. But obviously, if you look at the markets today, being able to tell a story is a huge advantage. For a journalist, I remember my Joe, who was my co-author on All the Devils Are Here and who edited Smartest Guys and was my editor for many years at Fortune, used to criticize my writing sometimes when I'd give him something, and he'd say, it doesn't move. It's just static. It's just sitting there on the page. And so for me, thinking about that concept of movement, that the story has to start somewhere and go somewhere, and it has to move, is really, really useful. Or you can think of it, somebody else once described it to me as gravity, that really good pieces have this almost gravitational pull that just pulls you through them. And you don't stop because you don't want to stop reading because there's this gravitational pull that's bringing you through it. And so I think trying to create that is really important. And I think that's some combination of compelling detail and character along with a certain sort of math-like proof behind it, that logic that pulls people through. Just as in a proof, a well-done math proof, one line leads to the next almost inevitably. I think stories are something of the same way. They should have that same kind of inevitability to them.
I was thinking about at your role at Fortune. We know that Carol Loomis worked at Fortune during the same time. Did you work together?
Well, we never worked together. Fortune was a pretty solitary place, but yes, we were there. I think she retired a few years before I left, but she was a huge presence at the magazine for most of the years I was there. I actually remember, funny, speaking about Enron, I remember the editors bringing her the draft of my Enron story before it was published, because Carol was regarded as the person at the magazine who really understood numbers and who would be able to read a piece like this and make sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed and that it made sense and that we weren't missing something, because it was obviously a big deal to publish the story and the magazine was under fire. And that was scary because Carol was this goddess at the time. And I remember her reading the piece and saying, no, it's all there. There's nothing that changed. It's solid. So
fantastic to hear, right?
Yeah, and really, when I look back on that, I suppose there's another element to it too, which is that Carol could have been different than she was. She kind of held my fate and the fate of that story in the palm of her hand at that moment. And had she been a different sort of character, she could have said, she could have just expressed some sort of skepticism without having anything factual. And she could have said, I don't really think so. This doesn't seem all that important to me. And she could have killed the story with that one line. And it's interesting. I think it is also a comment on what a high quality person she is, that she was just intellectually honest and she thought the story was good and that was that. There wasn't anything else there.
Really interesting. And I mean, for those who don't know, Carol Loomis edits the annual letters of Berkshire Hathaway, and has done for, I don't know if you know, but many years. Many years.
I don't know does she still do it? I'm not sure, but she probably does.
Talking about leaders, because I think you can call her a leader in that role. What kind of leader impresses you most?
I think someone who can balance competing perspectives. I think for many years in America, there's been this single-minded focus on profits as the sole gauge of whether a company is successful or not. And don't get me wrong, I think profits are important, because if you're not making money, you're not going to be in business for very long. You're running a charity, not a business. But I think it has betrayed a certain sort of very simplistic way of thinking for CEOs to say, well, that's my only job, is to focus on the bottom line. And I think a leader who can appreciate that their company is also impacting the world, impacting their employees, impacting their customers, and to be able to create some sort of balance between this need for profits now and the ability to produce those profits in 20 years, and a sense of how those profits are how the company's actions are impacting the welfare of both its employees and the world at large. I think for somebody to be able to weigh and understand all those competing perspectives and balance them is incredibly impressive. I'm not sure I could do it. There's that great line from F. Scott Fitzgerald that the true genius is somebody who can balance competing notions in their mind at the same time and not go crazy. And I think that says a lot. I think without it being too over the top, I think great leaders do inspire people to do their best work. And I think they inspire them through an interesting combination of enthusiasm and pragmatism. I think the person who just does, how amazing, how wonderful, doesn't get that much done. And the person who is pragmatic and can't say only pragmatic perhaps doesn't offer that much charisma either. But the person who can balance enthusiasm and pragmatism, I think, is also really impressive.
Yeah, and one leader we talked about was skilling.
Yeah.
And as humans, we're susceptible to trusting authorities. And so how do we avoid getting swayed by these kind of people with such power and such charisma?
I think it's really hard not to. I've said this before, you guys have probably heard me say it, but if I had left Goldman Sachs and been recruited to work at a up-and-coming energy company in Houston, Texas, and if I had ended up at Enron, perhaps even in Andy Fastow's division as a young finance person, would I have been a skeptic or would I have been a believer? I like to think I would have been a skeptic, of course, but I don't really know the answer to that. I think we are all products of the environment that we put ourselves into. And so I think most people, if they end up working in a company with an extraordinarily charismatic leader, they're going to end up believing in that leader's vision. It's the way human nature works. And I say most people, not all people. So I do think you have to choose your environment pretty carefully, because you will end up through this process of osmosis, you will end up being affected by your environment as much as you affect it. So I almost think it comes down to selection in the first place rather than any sort of actions once you've made the selection.
Both interesting and scary in a way.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. But we really are, when you think about it, people say, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. It's true. We are not, you're not this static, impermeable entity moving through the world over the course of your life. You're fluid. And as part of that fluidity, the places where you put yourself are going to end up shaping you. And so you have to be pretty cognizant that you're being shaped in a way that you like. And I think some can be very difficult in advance.
Do you think your math skills are helping you to stay more rational?
I do. I think that math teaches you doing proofs for a long time. So it's funny, my mom was throwing stuff out. She's not very sentimental, and she was throwing out a bunch of my old papers, and I was looking at some of my old math work from college, and I could recognize my own handwriting, but the math work itself, I had no idea. It was this very strange experience of knowing that something was in my handwriting, but having absolutely no idea what it said. So I don't want to pretend to still be a mathematician, but the training stays with you, which is that it's that logic that A has to lead to B, and that you have to separate yourself from the emotion of the story and just be able to see very clearly that one thing leads to the next. And I think if you're trained in that for a long period of time, for instance, through majoring in math in college, then that way of thinking stays with you.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, you also need to be an open-minded person to take in all perspectives as a journalist. And in the book, you write that when Skilling worked for McKinsey, partners there began saying that he's sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. And that was a quote that really stayed with me. And then I saw your byline on Twitter saying, often wrong, always in doubt.
Right.
So what does this mean to you?
Well, I think I put that there because I want to be clear that I don't think I'm right all the time, and I don't. I have plenty of examples where I haven't been right, and I think it's really important to leave yourself open to the possibility that you might be wrong while still moving forward. Because if you don't move forward, then if you let your doubt paralyze you, then you don't do anything. But you have to stay open to changing your mind or to a new fact coming along that makes you say, "Oh, I have to rethink everything I was thinking before before, because so much of it's not, what's the right way of saying this? I don't think seeing things clearly is the linear accumulation of evidence. I think you accumulate evidence and all of a sudden something comes along that completely changes the prism through which you see the evidence that you've accumulated. And that's the moment of change, not the weighting of each fact against each other. It's all of a sudden the prism through which you see what you've gathered changes, and you see it differently. And you have to be open for those moments, or open to those moments.
I mean, to take a practical example of that, I mean, for example, what if you make up your mind that a person is a crook, and then in the end he's actually good?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you handle that type of situation? And have you been in that? Have you had that experience yourself?
I think the closest one for me is probably thinking about Elon Musk, and I think through the way I normally think about people, I would have thought of Elon Musk as maybe not a crook. That's a little bit too harsh, but as sort of the P.T. Barnum of our age, someone who's willing to lie and cheat in order to get what he wants. And so I would have thought for a long time that would have meant that Tesla wouldn't succeed. And I think for me, starting to frame things as this, I don't know when it occurred to me, but this idea that the visionary and fraudster aren't on opposite ends of the spectrum, but are sort of where the circle meets, and that one can become the other through a quirk of fate that is really hard to predict in advance. And that for me changed the prism through which I see things. And I thought, well, Musk could do all these bad things and have all these characteristics that one might normally say he will end up where Jeff Skilling ended up, not necessarily in jail. To me, the line between, and maybe it's worth talking about, but the line between wrongdoing and actually criminal fraud is another sort of interesting line. And just because a company ends up bankrupt doesn't mean the person running it is a criminal. But being able to see that, Musk could very well go down in history as a visionary. And that doesn't mean all these characteristics of his aren't there, but that those characteristics don't mean that this is where he's going to end up.
I mean, do you typically wait with making a commitment on your perspective? I mean, do you slow it down? Your commitment to that, or?
Well, so the nice thing about being a writer is that you don't necessarily have to commit to a perspective, right? I mean, it's not, that's the bias toward action. If you're an investor, then you probably have to commit, but if you're a writer, you can explain it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
You rarely have to see the world if you're a writer. You rarely have to see it through the black and white of I'm going to invest in this company and believe, or I'm not going to invest in this company. You can lay out the case, which I think is actually, to me, is far more interesting, because the world is not black and white.
It's really fascinating how much luck plays into this.
Yeah.
Like in the end, there's so much.
Right. I think it does. I think it does.
So coming back to the book you said you were writing right now, can you tell us a little bit about that, and what is it about?
So it's really difficult. I think it's probably the hardest book I've tried to write. Joe and I are trying to write about the pandemic, but through the lens of what it has shown about, really focused on the U.S., what it has shown about our economy's weaknesses, the cracks in our economic and social setup that the pandemic either revealed or exacerbated. So it's difficult, and the pandemic is obviously ongoing, which makes things more challenging. It didn't come to an end, and will probably never come to an end. So I think some of the changes it's not a thing that is going to come and go. So it's challenging. It's interesting to think about it. I think it's incredibly important, these issues, but the issues are obvious. I think the story, trying to figure out how to tell it as a story is the hardest part.
Yeah, I'm dealing with a moving target and trying to draw any conclusions. I can really relate as an investor, because the companies are always developing and it's always changing, and
right.
You never know. But I'm really looking forward to the book.
Thank you. I hope it gets done. Again, I hope my publisher is not listening to this. It's going to get done, really. It's going to get done.
Hopefully we can have another talk by then.
I would love that.
This is a podcast about books. Typically, I mean, our aim is to learn from books, and not only books, of course. We like to read more or less everything. I was wondering, are you a big reader yourself?
I am. Yeah. I actually grew up, my parents never had a TV set and still don't own a TV. So I've started watching more TV lately in the pandemic year, but there's no TV anywhere in this apartment. And I'm very, very late to watching TV instead of reading because I just didn't grow up that way and it doesn't occur to me.
How much reading time do you spend in a typical day?
It depends on so I do a podcast with a professor at the University of Chicago named Luigi Zingales, and we often have to read for our podcast. So I mix that reading with the reading I do for pure pleasure. And so it depends. It depends. And I've started watching more TV with my children. And so so it depends on whether I've made them go to bed or whether we watch TV. So.
And is it both fiction and nonfiction?
Yes. Yeah.
When will you write your first fiction book?
My children are very eager for that because they say the things I write are extremely boring and they would like me to write something that isn't boring. So maybe one of these years.
And do you have some specific titles, some recommendations?
So I tend to, I could give historical titles, but I tend to I'll be focused more on things that I've read recently that have really stood out to me. If you haven't read Martin Gurry's book, The Death of the Elites, I think that's really interesting and provocative. Adrian Wooldridge's new book about meritocracy, I think is really thought-provoking. It's a history of meritocracy, the idea of meritocracy, and in the end, sort of a defense of this idea that is very much under fire today. So those are two books that I've read that I've really enjoyed and found very, very thought-provoking, intellectually speaking. On a less exalted note, because Dune is being released, I'm going back and rereading Dune, and I had actually never read as a kid past the first book. So I now have the whole Dune series to read, which is super, super exciting.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for a great conversation about you and your books and teaching us many lessons and insights. Do you have something more you want to add before we finish up?
No, thank you very much for having me on. This was delightful, and enjoy your evening, and hopefully we'll talk again.
Great. And lastly, where can our audience follow you? The podcast, Twitter, the books?
Yeah, I'm not as active on social media as I should be. I never have been, but I am on Twitter at Bethany Mac12, and I usually will try to tweet my podcasts or whatever I've done. I'm not always great about it, but I try.
Thank you so much, Bethany.
Thank you guys so much. Good luck to you.
Thank you for listening to Investing by the Books, a podcast by Redeye. You can follow us on Twitter at IB_Redeye and email us at ib.podcast@redeye.se. To improve the podcast, we really appreciate your feedback, so please rate and review us. Notice that the content in this podcast is not and shall not be construed as investment advice. This information is meant to be informative and for general purposes only. For a full disclaimer, visit redeye.se. For the sound engineering and editing of this podcast, we thank Gustav Tesch. I'm your host, Eddie Palmian, and until next time, I sincerely wish you the best of luck on your journey through life and investing.